Well, good morning. I had to check what the time is because these days during 2020 have just blurred one into the other. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. You have tuned in to the Mail and Guardian's webinar in association with the kind compliments of GEMS. And today our discussion title is COVID-19 Vaccine and the Road to Recovery. A very, very important conversation that's happening as we watch live events across the world as the first of the world's COVID-19 vaccines start rolling out in various parts, the UK being the first of them. And to talk about where we stand right now from a scientific point of view, from a social point of view, I'm joined by some fantastic panelists. My name is Marcel Gordon. I'm here just to make sure as many important talk topics and questions are being answered. And I'll leave it up to the experts that we have on the panel to really do most of the talking. We've got with us Professor Shabir Mahdi. He's a clinician, he's an epidemiologist, he's a vaccine expert. I mean, I'm a news anchor, but I think it's fair to say that Dr. Mahdi has probably spent more time on television this year than I have. Yeah. So I really thank him for his time this morning. He has been somebody that so many of us who are lay people have been able to lean on for important and educational and scientific information. Professor Mahdi, thank you so much for joining us, Professor of Vaccinology at WITS and co-director of the African Leadership Initiative for Vaccinology Expertise. We'll find out all more about that a little later on. We've also got Dr. Stan Moloabe. He's the principal officer at Government Employees Medical Scheme, known to all of us as GEMS, and of course, a man who I think couldn't have gotten his timing any better by taking on his position at the beginning of 2020. So we'll find out more about where he stands. And of course, it's through GEMS that we are having this conversation on this platform at Mail and Guardian. And then we've got Professor Mariki Venter, who is a medical virologist, also looking forward to picking her brain. She is with the University of Pretoria, head of zoonotic, arbo and respiratory virus program, and she's a professor in that department of medical virology. So that is a mouthful of all of the titles and the experience that we have on this panel, and we're hoping to get the most out of all of you. Thank you so much again to join us. As we become custom in these webinars for Mail and Guardian, we start off by just allowing all of our panelists to give us a standing statement about where they stand or where they find themselves in terms of the topic of conversation for the day. And it really couldn't be more current and more relevant for us to be talking about the COVID-19 vaccine and the road to recovery. And I think let's start with Professor Mariki Venter as a virologist. I remember reading a statement you were quoted in earlier in our journey of lockdown, of coronavirus. We were learning to say the word still, and people were wondering, should we be taking the influenza jab? You know, and that now seems like a lifetime ago because we're talking about completely different jabs now. And I remember Professor Mariki Venter explaining why it's important for us to still be taking these jabs. It won't protect you completely from the COVID-19, but it's still important. Professor Venter, we've come a long way since you had to make those statements in the public domain.
Yes, I think none of us would have thought that we'd be where we are today a year ago. So I think COVID-19 has seriously disrupted all of our lives, and we probably didn't expect to see it to the extent that we are at the moment. I think the first interview that I've had was back in February, and I think at that stage we were still just looking at what was going on in China. A lot of the clinical relevance that were reflected during that time is actually still relevant. If we look at the fatality rate that they initially reported, the high risk groups that were the elderly, we've now also added risk groups in obese people and in high blood pressure and so on. And I think that we probably all underestimated what would happen over the coming year. I think that we do at the moment see light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines finally coming out. It's not going to be a quick road for us in South Africa. We're still probably quite far away from the majority of our population to be able to receive vaccine. However, it's very important that we all understand how the vaccine can help us, and that we make sure that if it becomes available, people are willing to take it. and that the ones that are available out there are actually quite safe, and it would be a good way of controlling the epidemic or the pandemic.
So a long way to go. We are at the beginning of that road, aren't we? If we can bring Professor Shabir Mahdi in here. I feel like we've learned so many new words this year, us as lay people. But I think one of the most important things for me, what this year has taught us, is that science and facts really need to be at the core of us dealing with important things like public health. And you hear the conversations as far as in the UK, where people are saying they hope that 2020 has taught us why it's important that organizations like the NHS is taken care of and not stripped bare. As we start this conversation, Professor Mahdi, are you hopeful that the lessons that we've learned from 2020 will be heeded as we now start a new chapter in trying to ensure that as many South Africans are protected from the coronavirus with whatever vaccine is eventually made available to us?
Well, I'm hopeful that the experience from 2020 is going to create a greater appetite on the part of scientists to actually go into research. And it sounds sort of a contradiction in that the scientists should be doing research. But the reality in South Africa is that many people that actually train in the field of sciences actually don't go into research. And that's one of the reasons why, as an example right now, of the 40 COVID-19 vaccine trials that are already in humans, none of those vaccines have actually come out from the African continent, let alone South Africa. And that is an indictment in terms of the underinvestment when it comes to research in Africa, including in South Africa. And hopefully this will be a lesson that we can't allow for that to happen. As Professor has mentioned, whether I'm hopeful or not for 2021, unfortunately, I've become much more pessimistic over the past since the results of the COVID-19 vaccines have been published. And the reason for that is that South Africa has unfortunately lagged behind in terms of trying to gain access to meaningful quantities of the COVID vaccine, and particularly for us to be able to gain access before we end up reaching a peak with the next wave. And the resurgence, as you know, is already upon us, and it's highly unlikely that we're going to get even one dose of COVID-19 vaccine to be used in the public before around about April of next year, by which time this particular resurgence would probably already have peaked. So unfortunately, there has been a problem in terms of planning, in terms of being proactive. And I think South Africa, unfortunately, put too much sort of effort in trying to gain access of vaccine through the COVAX facility, which has got issues of its own for an upper middle income country such as South Africa, and was not proactive in terms of engaging with other companies and striking up bilateral arrangements. And it's particularly disappointing because we're doing 4 vaccine trials in South Africa for COVID-19, 4. And that puts us in a very competitive position to be able to negotiate with those countries for South Africa to gain early access of reasonable quantities of the vaccine at an affordable price. And that is something that we should have taken on, and we should have been much more proactive on it. Unfortunately, we haven't, and consequently, we've pretty much gone down in a pecking order in terms of when we're likely to be able to gain access to any meaningful quantity of COVID-19 vaccines.
Professor Mahdi, it will be very interesting to dig into those lessons that you say you've learned from, and where we're at the beginning of the road. And like you just said, it's a very, very long one. Let's hear now from Dr. Stan Molowabe. He's the principal officer at the Government Employees Medical Scheme. Now, Dr. Molowabe, you took this position officially on the 1st of February 2020. And if you look at the timing of it all, I dread to think that you must have thought, what have you done? 2020 was not the right year to be taking this position at this country's, I think, the second biggest medical scheme in the country. What have you learned this year in this position that you found yourself in?
Yeah, Marcel, talk about a baptismal of fire. I think that's basically how I can best describe the fact that within a month of me taking up the position, the president announced the Disaster Management Act, and we went into lockdown on the 26th of March, and we had to adjust the way we do business. Suffice to say that we continued, and this is really what we took out of this. We suddenly proved to ourselves that we are an agile organization, in that we could change the model of working from home, like most organizations have done, but continued to deliver the services to our members and our beneficiaries, 1.94 million of those beneficiaries. But I think the most important thing in terms of what is our obligation to our members, it's promoting access to the appropriate health care. And we continue to ensure that our members have access to the benefits that they are entitled to. And of relevance now, in terms of looking at the issues, the discussions around the vaccine, it's the fact that when you actually look at what we have been saying at GEMS, our bias has been towards prevention of disease. And I mean, this is really, we are now faced with a situation where we really have to look at, depending on the availability and the things that Prof. Madi have said, but we want to be able to ensure that the beneficiaries of GEMS have access to the vaccine whenever it becomes available, in terms of the program that will have been outlined by government. But more importantly, I think, is when we want to serve as a prototype of what the rest of the country can have access to. And that's really what we want. We want to be, we already are a pilot at scale as GEMS, in terms of the policy changes with regard to how healthcare will be financed. But that is really the main thing for us, to be the blueprint of what is possible in terms of universal healthcare.
Okay, it will be interesting. I'm sure a lot of people watching or listening right now will be interested to hear what you have to say, that once the vaccine does arrive, hopefully, fingers and thumbs crossed, by sometime in 2021, how medical aids are going to be busying themselves in helping that distribution. But we'll get to that hopefully a little bit later. Professor Venter, if I could bring you in and maybe just take us back to what's been in the news this week. Lots of news this week, as has been the case in 2020. The latest statement from that, or the second last statement from the health department, looking at the latest spike in new cases of coronavirus amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. Now, as a virologist, you said in your opening statement, you've learned continuously about how this thing, this almost hidden monster behaves. What can we glean from this latest spike, saying that 15 to 19-year-olds were the ones that have been most prevalent amongst the new cases, and because they are quite mobile, and because so many of them are asymptomatic, it does make them quite dangerous, doesn't it?
Yes, I think this is actually an early warning for us right before the holiday season start now. So as you know, that age group is probably the group that may experience the least severe disease. But because they are asymptomatic, they will go back to their families, and most of them still live with their parents, and probably many maybe even with their grandparents. And they are the ones that's going to go back and infect the elderly, which can then result in many more hospitalizations and severe cases. So right here in front of our Christmas season, when we all are really exhausted of coronavirus and was hoping to have a nice Christmas holiday in the summer in South Africa, it is time, or it's very important that we don't forget now and get fatigued and let go of our control of the epidemic. We've actually done particularly well relative to the rest of the world. And if you look at our epidemic curve, just a month ago, we were really coming down, and the cases were dropping significantly. And now, before the holiday season, it is now unfortunately increasing again, and we will have to make sure that we don't let go, basically, and have social gatherings where we will see an increase of cases. So unfortunately, this virus is not like many other viruses that's been in the news in the past, such as Ebola, that will show you when there's a big outbreak going on. Most of the cases is actually asymptomatic. but the people that will suffer the most is then the high-risk groups, and they are the ones that will be exposed. So unfortunately, our teenagers and young people, you cannot go to big parties during this holiday season. It's going to be important that you actually think about others around you. It's not just about you. And this is really, I think, what this pandemic has taught us, is it's social responsibility to other people around you.
Social responsibility, other people around us. Professor Mahdi, I was quite interested to read about the work that you've done in other vaccines and research, very much believing in the need for a community-led approach to that kind of research. I think specifically about your work studying the pneumococcal disease. And I read a beautiful, quite profound quote from you at the time when you received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the South African Medical Research Council for that work. And you thanked the parents and the children who had participated in that first vaccine trial of pneumococcal trial in Soweto. Do you think that we have learned enough about how South African society operates, that there needs to be a community approach, not just to things like research, but also to things like awareness, why it's important for us to wear masks, why it's important for us to social distance, and not just from what behavioral psychologists have told me. We don't respond well to just, don't do that because I said so. A community-based approach, both to research and behavioral changes that we need to fight this thing, is very much needed. Are we getting through to people in that way?
Yeah, so I think that's really an important point. And if the biggest mistake we made in terms of our initial approach to the pandemic is we didn't include social behavioral scientists in the Ministerial Advisory Committee. And social behavioral scientists, unfortunately themselves, didn't come quick enough to the fore in terms of assisting government, assisting the public with messaging. And that has really been, so what we suffering at the moment is of decency creeping in around issues of the wearing of face masks, not avoiding mass gatherings, issues around physical distancing. The reason we're struggling with that right now is because we really didn't have a strategy in terms of engagement with the community. It requires more than the president to go on TV to say you should do this and you will do A, B, and C. It's about getting communities to understand why it needs to be done right at the outset. So right now, we're pretty much deep into this pandemic, and for there to be a fundamental change in terms of behavior and the course of behavior of individuals, it's extremely difficult to implement, and particularly, as has been pointed out, is that people are tired about hearing the same message without truly comprehending why it is what is being requested of them. But I just want to follow that up. So I fully agree that we're in no position to ask everyone to wear a face mask 24/7. Asking people to continue maintaining physical distancing is impractical in most instances, especially as an example, people needing to get to work. They need to use public transport. They need to use taxis. There's no physical distancing taking place there. So we need to sit back now and ask ourselves, which is probably the most impactful intervention that is going to assist us in terms of controlling the rate of transmission of the virus? And the answer to that is pretty straightforward, based on experience from the past few weeks alone. And that is the single most important intervention that can be put into place in South Africa right now, is a complete ban on any mass gathering in a poorly ventilated indoor space. In fact, there shouldn't be any sort of percentage occupancy, irrespective of whether it's 50%, 20%, or 100% occupancy. In a poorly ventilated area, that leads itself to super spreader events. And as Marike has correctly pointed out, it's not about just people that have attended that particular event. It's about them taking the virus out into their households, infecting other people in their household. So in the United States, as an example, 80% of all infections that are taking place currently actually trace back to super spreader events. So if we're wanting to bring this resurgence under control, and people are still going to continue getting infected, but if we are wanting to minimize a rapid escalation in terms of number of cases, we need to put in place an immediate ban in terms of mass gatherings in indoor spaces, period.
Do you think then that the contact tracing system that we have in place is effective? Because again, we have to keep pointing out we live in one of the most unequal societies in the world, and we hear the health ministry encouraging us, download the app so that you can download this, download that, when the majority of our country don't have access to data, A, or B, wouldn't understand what that means, especially amongst the elderly, especially amongst those living in very rural areas. Where do we stand in terms of the importance and effectiveness of contact tracing, especially when you look at the sort of private hospital system versus public health, and of course, between the haves and the have-nots? Professor Mahdi?
Yeah, I mean, it's naively optimistic to believe that using an app for contact tracing was going to have any sort of impact in South Africa. In fact, the apps didn't even work in a country such as the United Kingdom in terms of its efficiency for contact tracing. And when 1 million out of 54 million South Africans or 59 million have downloaded the app, it's basically you can close the system and it wouldn't have any impact in terms of the trajectory of the resurgence. Contact tracing is something that's nice to hear about and talk about, but in terms of its actual implementation, we need to understand what contact tracing actually entails. What it involves is identifying all of the close contacts of an individual from 3 days before the individual became symptomatic up to the time the person goes into isolation. Every average adult in South Africa has close unto 120 close contacts, approximately 20 close contacts per day. If a person is diagnosed 3 days after they became symptomatic and going into isolation, that's the equivalent of 6 days times 20, which is 120. So that translates to, if you're diagnosing 1,000 new cases per day, you need to actually have 120 close contacts that need to be traced, which is obviously not feasible by any stretch of the imagination. So when we talk of contact tracing, we're probably speaking a different language. It's not about just going to the household of the individual to find out who that person is living with. It's much more extensive. And in terms of where we are currently in the epidemic, in terms of the trajectory of the virus in South Africa, basically contact tracing is a fruitless exercise. It's not going to achieve anything. And like I said, if we're wanting to do anything meaningful right now, it's about putting a ban on mass gatherings in poorly ventilated indoor spaces.
And especially ones involving matriculants, I think is safe to say, compared to the news that we've been having the last couple of weeks. Professor Martin, thank you.
It's not just matriculant. It's about the pubs, it's about the bars, it's about the shebeens.
No, absolutely, I agree with you. I was just being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Based on the news that we've been seeing coming out about these gatherings. Just to remind people, we've got a little chat room going on the side. We will be cleaning some questions from there shortly. We've got quite a few people following the conversation. Mark Banfield, based on us talking about that app, the tracing app that government is encouraging us to download. He says networks should be mandated to automatically install the app to all smartphones. That's an interesting one there. We've also got a poll going at the moment there on the right-hand side of your screen. The question up at the moment is going to end soon. Will you get the COVID-19 vaccine? 46% so far says yes, for sure. Most likely is 16%. Less likely is 9%. No, definitely not, says 8%. As we continue our conversation with our panelists, allow me to bring Dr. Stan Molowabe in here. He's the Principal Officer of GEMS. Now, Dr. Molowabe, I saw you nodding your head when I started speaking to Professor Mahdi about the need for a community approach, a community-based approach to all kinds of things, be it research, be it education, be it awareness, and just getting people on the side of our medical practitioners. At GEMS, obviously, the people who are your members are your community, but they're not just in a bubble. They are parts of various communities from different walks of life. How important is that to you for that approach to be part and parcel of what you do? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, yes. So, yeah. What is very significant about GEMS members is the fact that they are actually the first line workers in terms of the services that are rendered by government. And as a result, they are part of the community. They serve the community. And I think that is very significant. But, you know, the reason why I was nodding at that stage, I was just reminded of the fact that there's something we used to call, I think it's now called public health, but we used to call it community health when I was at medical school. And one of the things I about community health is to educate people about whatever measures that are needed to prevent disease. I just remembered one of the things we used to use in community health called GOBI-FF. I think it's a UNICEF program, and within that GOBI-FF, the I is for immunization, which is a preventative initiative for preventing various types of disease. But the point is that people will not know that they need to take whatever measure there is, whether it be non-medical, as we have learned through the pandemic, how important the masks, the washing of hands, the sanitizing, the social distancing are. People will not know about these things unless we educate. And from a community point of view, education, I think, is the most important thing for us to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of recovering from the pandemic.
If we could shift our attention now to a potential vaccine. And I know for us, it's very difficult. We're watching international news right now because we're seeing some wonderful scenes coming out of the UK where the elderly and frontline medical workers are getting their first jabs, and they'll be getting their next jab in about 3 weeks' time. If I could bring Professor Venter in here. For those who are struggling to understand how this all works, can you explain to us in layman's terms how a vaccine against something like COVID-19 would work in your body?
Okay, so just the basic principle of a vaccine is there's several different technologies that we can use, but the main principle is really that we show the body a dead version or a part of the virus that represents the most important part of the virus that will give you antibodies or protection. So when your body sees a foreign protein or a virus, it produces antibodies to that that then can be recalled quickly in the form of a memory cell when it sees the virus again, and then neutralize that. So neutralize means it binds to the virus and inactivate it. There's also a T cell arm to this, which means T cells will look at infected cells and will go and kill those cells if they see the virus. So in a natural infection, that is then seeing the actual virus, and the virus will make you very sick, and your body will produce antibodies and this T cell response to eliminate the virus. But in the process, you may either die if it's really serious, or you become really sick. But eventually, you will recover, and your body will then, the next time when it sees this virus, be able to quickly react to it. So a vaccine is then based on the principle that we only use a safe version of this. So the current vaccines that are in development for COVID-19, none of them actually have the whole live virus. So they only contain the spike protein. So the spike protein is the surface protein of the SARS coronavirus 2. And this is the area that's on the outside of the virus and that your body would see first, and then produce these neutralizing antibodies. So the different options that's available at the moment is firstly is the Oxford or AstraZeneca vaccine. This virus or this vaccine makes use of a vector called chimp adenovirus. So the adenovirus is a common flu or common cold-like virus that all of us see. But the problem is, because it's so common, your body will very rapidly inactivate this vector. So the vector is basically what presents this spike protein on its outside. But because we then see the adenovirus regularly, your body will quickly produce antibodies that it remembers to the old cold viruses and then inactivate this. So what they've done is basically use a chimp version of this. So adenovirus that occurs in chimps, that basically is similar or the same almost as the human versions, but we've never seen it. They've also then manipulated this this vector so that it's not able to replicate in humans. So once you get the vaccine, it will basically just go through one round of replication, present this spike protein to your body, and you will then make antibodies to this. But it's impossible for this virus to actually give you COVID-19 because it's not the whole virus, and it also can actually not infect you. Then there's two other versions, that's mRNA vaccines. So the mRNA vaccines is from Pfizer and Moderna, that's currently in the news. So they are used in the United States, probably, or they want to roll them out now, and Pfizer in the UK as well. We would likely not get them, but I think Shabir will talk to that. But what we, the way that they work, it's just a small piece of this spike protein's mRNA. So mRNA is the messenger RNA that produces a protein from your cells. So this, you have DNA in your cell nucleus, and then from there, to make a protein, it will produce mRNA, and then the protein from that. So what they've done is basically just use a small piece of this spike protein mRNA, packaged in a lipid bilayer. So the lipid is basically just to be able to get it over your cell membrane. And then once it's in your cell, it uses your cells or material, your enzymes, to produce these proteins. So it's just a very small piece of the spike protein. It's not even the whole thing. So it's impossible for it to make you sick. It's also impossible for you to, I know people are scared that it will manipulate your DNA. It's impossible because it's mRNA. You need a protein or an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, which you find in viruses such as HIV, to make DNA from this again. And you don't have that. So humans don't have this protein. So you can only make proteins from mRNA. We can't make DNA from mRNA again. So it basically make little factories to produce this this protein of the coronavirus. And then as they get excreted, your body makes antibodies to them. But mRNA is very labile, so it means it's very sensitive to degradation. You have enzymes in your cells that's called RNases, which eats RNA. So it was actually put there to eat virus RNA or RNA that floats around that's already been used. And so once it's actually produced protein, these RNA gets degraded. So then it will disappear from your cells. So it's relatively safe, or it's very safe. It's just new. We haven't used it in vaccines before. But the advantage of this is that it's very easy to produce. So you don't need big reactors. You can produce it synthetically. It's safe because it only contains a small part of the protein. It's not even the whole spike protein. But it's just a new technology. So it's very easy to produce in an upscale in a large quantities. And that's why these companies were able to produce so much already relative to the other technology, which is a bit more complicated. But the disadvantage is, of course, then because RNA is so labile, you need to keep it at very low temperature, so at -80, to be able to transport it in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, or -20 for Moderna. And that's quite difficult in a place like Africa to get that around. So we're already used to vaccine technologies that makes use of dead viruses, or the subunit or partial viruses, or even live viruses, because we can freeze dry them, and then we can transport them at room temperature. So the COVID, the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine is basically, you can keep that in a normal fridge, so at 2 to 4 degrees. So these mRNA vaccines has the disadvantage that it must be at a very low temperature. Then the one that's produced by Russia is called the Sputnik vaccine. So this is also on the same principle as the Oxford vaccine, except they use adenovirus 26 for the first round, and then they boost with adenovirus 5, both that present the spike protein on the surface. The disadvantage is that these are common human viruses. So we have some concern that it will be inactivated by your body. But they've had, according to them, good results. They're not quite as open as the other companies with their results. So I think going forward, we will have to see how our wallet works, but the technology is well developed. So it's not new technology. I think then the last one that one can maybe just touch on is this nanoparticles. So people also get scared with the word nano. So basically what this is, it's the vaccine that's produced by Novavax. So the Novavax basically use the spike protein also, but as the actual protein, and then they present it on what's called the adjuvant. An adjuvant is something that just stimulates the immune response, and that's on a what's called a nanoparticle. So they basically produce very small nanoparticles that contains these spike proteins, and this then rapidly produce neutralizing antibodies, also very specifically only to the spike protein. And so it's also this technology has been used widely, but it's basically now just been optimized, and they get a very, very strong and good neutralizing antibody response. But it's not quite as far in vaccine trials yet as the other two. So the front runners is the first 4 that I talked about.
Goodness me, and that's amongst many tens of others that have been on the go. Professor Marty, if I could bring you in there. Professor Venter now bringing us to speed on the 4 major ones that she thinks was important for us to keep a lookout for. From what I remember when we started talking about these vaccines, it was the Oxford one that took the approach that their trials needed to take place across the world because, as is the case with these vaccine trials, I've just learned from people like you, it's important to see how those involved in the trials in different parts of the world react to it, because diseases, vaccines, all of these things react differently depending on where they are being found. And work that you did, and I must credit Laura Lopez Gonzalez, who did a great long read on this last month, looking at the work that people like you have done in vaccine trials in South Africa. Something like the rotavirus vaccine research trial that you did, which very much looked at the reaction to children here in South Africa to the vaccine for the rotavirus compared to children in Malawi, showing why it's important for these things to be trialed in different parts of the world, because there are various things that can impact on it. How confident are you that these vaccines that are being rolled out will very easily be able to be used in South Africa, or do we still have a long way to go before we can ensure that a vaccine that perhaps was part of Pfizer or any number of these big pharmaceuticals will be effective down in sub-Saharan Africa?
Right, so I think you really raise an important issue, and just perhaps for the benefit of the audience, just to expand a little on the experience with rotavirus, which is a vaccine that's developed to prevent children from developing viral disease. The experience from that was that in the United States, as an example, that vaccine prevented 90% of severe rotavirus illness in children. In South Africa, it was 70%, and in Malawi, it was 30%. So intuitively, one would say that this vaccine is less useful in Malawi than in the United States. But because of the higher force of infection, the greater number of children in Malawi that end up developing severe rotavirus disease, a vaccine that is also 30 or 40% effective in Malawi will prevent more cases of severe viral disease than in the United States, where severe rotavirus is uncommon despite the vaccine having a higher efficacy. So we need to avoid becoming fixated with just the efficacy estimate or this percentage that is cited, 95% or 70%. That percentage needs to be interpreted in a context of the burden of disease, how common the illness is, and that sort of provides a public health perspective in terms of the value of the vaccine. Now, when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, the one way to see whether it's scientifically accurate to be able to extrapolate from the experience in another country to your own country is to at least to do some sort of testing of the vaccine locally. And what we understand about these vaccines now is it obviously, as Mariki pointed out, the manner in which vaccines work is that it induces an immune response. So if you've got a study that's done in the United States as an example that shows 95% efficacy, and it also measured the immune response to the vaccine in that particular setting, and then what we would need to do in South Africa to determine whether we can sort of extrapolate from that experience is to see what is the immune response in a South African context. Is it comparable to the immune response of individuals that are vaccinated in the United States? So that is one manner in which we can have some level of certainty as to whether the experience of one vaccine in a different setting would be similar to your own setting. But unfortunately, that's a simplistic perspective. At the end of the day, when these vaccines are introduced, we would still need to do some level of surveillance to determine just how effective these vaccines are. But it doesn't need to be these large clinical trials, which are very expensive and takes a long time to get to an answer. So just looking at immune responses to these vaccines, I'm fairly confident that the experience with these vaccines in other countries is probably likely to translate as such in South Africa as well, because this virus seems to be very susceptible to the antibody that is being induced by these vaccines. And that's the reason we're getting efficacy of 95%. And just from Pfizer, more recently, they've shown that, in fact, even just after a single dose of vaccine, they already started to see differences in terms of the attack rate of COVID-19 between people that received the vaccine and those that were in the control arm.
So one of the hats that you carry at the moment is director of the African Leadership Initiative for Vaccinology Expertise. Do you think we've made enough inroads into the need for this kind of research and leadership to be based on the African continent and not just, and I hate to use the term because we've seen a lot of that being spoken about on social media, not just Africa being used as a guinea pig, as we've seen in the history of something called a medical colonization in the past. Have we made enough inroads in understanding why scientifically it's important for leadership to come from the continent, not just the other way around?
So for exactly the reasons you just stated, it's important for leadership and for us to be innovative in the continent rather than to be dependent perpetually on other countries outside of the continent. And in fact, that's the reason why we've established this initiative live. It's really to create that sort of critical skill so that we can take vaccine research to another level, not just in South Africa, but in partnership, in collaboration with other Africans from other countries. Unfortunately, it's not a quick fix. That sort of an initiative takes 10, 15 years for it to materialize, to be able to get a large enough critical skill set together to take it to the next level. So it's something that was already initiated about 3 years ago. And it's really unfortunate because in 2009, with the swine flu pandemic as an example, the African Union actually in 2012 made a very strong statement about Africa needing to develop manufacturing facilities and needing to be involved in vaccine research in 2012. 8 years later, nothing has happened. When we had the swine flu pandemic in 2009, South Africa ended up being the only country on the entire continent to eventually receive the swine flu pandemic vaccine, except the vaccine only became available in South Africa after the swine flu pandemic had actually been declared to be over. And that's pretty much where we're sitting right now, is that vaccines are probably only going to become available in Africa, in South Africa, after this pandemic has pretty much started to really taper out and probably to have ended. But it speaks about the lack of investment in research.
Is this where I'm supposed to bring Dr. Molowabi in so that we can find out what organizations like GEMS will be doing to help with that? Because there's big talk about the need for investment in research. There's the question around proper intellectual property and distribution being key as well. Dr. Molowabi from GEMS, if I can bring you in there, where do you see an organization like GEMS and, of course, all of South Africa's other powerful medical aid schemes fitting in terms of the need for investment in research right here in our own backyard, and to be taking the lead when it comes to vaccine rollout and of course, the resources that are needed for things like that?
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. I think our role as a healthcare funder is very clear. We certainly have a role to play. There are, however, are constraints, and then I need to mention this. It's very important. We are a medical scheme. We are regulated, so the business of a medical scheme is very well defined. However, within what is allowable, we are able to do research to an extent to ensure that we inform our decisions, our healthcare funding decisions into the future. And we also participate in various support programs, whether it be for government as the employer in this instance. Remember that government is a very important stakeholder within the GEMS environment, simply because they are the employer who pay the subsidy of the government employees. But the owners of the scheme are really the members of the scheme. So everything that we do is geared at ensuring that the members get the benefits. However, we participate. We do have an R&D division, which we have just established. It's growing, and we do participate in doing research that will inform how healthcare will be funded, up to and including participation in NHI-related program as we move towards universal healthcare, attaining universal healthcare in the future. So research is important. There's no doubt about it. Funding is always a challenge for things like research, but we allocate to what is allowable in terms of the constraints of our regulatory environment.
Now speaking of the regulatory environment, if we can talk just for a minute about the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. We just saw the news, I think, overnight from the US, where the FDA has approved emergency use of the vaccine there, if I've got that correct. I just saw a very quick flash of it this morning before we started our webinar. Professor Mahdi, I think you're the one that's down to answer this. What are we expecting from the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority in terms of authorization and regulation of vaccines once we are at that point in this journey?
Right. So, I mean, it's obviously up to SAHPRA to pronounce in terms of what its plans are for an expedited review and at least an emergency use authorization of the vaccines. But we've got a problem, and the problem that we face is that usually it's up to companies to submit a dossier to the country for approval because they would plan to import the vaccine into the country. Right now, the companies are not going to be rushing to South Africa to get a vaccines license simply because they don't really have any vaccine to provide to South Africa. So my suggestion to SAHPRA is that they actually need to be proactive, and what they should be doing and considering is that any vaccine that has been licensed by the European Union Medical Authority, by the FDA as an example, or as well as in the UK by the regulatory authority, any of those vaccines that are licensed, even just for emergency use authorization, there should be reciprocity on the part of SAHPRA in that they would actually accept that as adequate conditions to actually allow for the use of under an EUA, an emergency use authorization. We cannot afford the luxury of spending 3 or 6 months for vaccines to be approved for local use in the context of a pandemic. So, like I said, it's really up to SAHPRA to pronounce, but at the end of the day, there's very little reason why we shouldn't piggyback on the reviews, the scientific reviews that has been done by other well-established regulatory authorities. And the companies are not going to go to South Africa to submit dossiers to SAHPRA for them to approve. That's not going to happen until 2022 at the earliest.
Goodness me. Let's take a quick look at our poll that's on the go at the moment. The question up there at the moment: what is your key concern with regards to the vaccine? Trust, 15%, cost, 6%, and 28% saying safety is their key concern when it comes to a potential COVID-19 vaccine. And it allows us to then dip into a question from one of our viewers, Carla Botba, who has asked, how do we as health workers encourage patients to take the vaccine and discourage vaccine misinformation? An interesting opinion that I heard coming out of the States is that there is a view that even certain health workers wouldn't trust to take the vaccine for various reasons. So it's not just ordinary citizens that will have issues with trusting something being jabbed into them that could potentially save their lives and their families, but also healthcare workers within themselves would have questions about it. I don't know whether Professor Mahdi or Professor Venter would like to approach that subject matter.
Yeah, so firstly, it doesn't assist for the Chief Justice of South Africa to be completely reckless in terms of his complete lack of understanding of what COVID-19 vaccines are. So that sort of messaging by key public figures simply doesn't assist a cause in terms of gaining public confidence when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines. Healthcare workers have got an important role in terms of getting people to understand, and as Prof. Fenter actually outlined, the nonsense that Chief Justice was alluding to about manipulating the DNA is impossible to achieve for the type of messenger RNA vaccines we've got. So healthcare workers have got a responsibility, but there's also a responsibility on other leading public figures not to speak and pronounce on things of which they got very little understanding on. And that becomes a major problem in a country such as South Africa, where because it's a public figure that makes some sort of announcement, it basically creates even greater confusion in the public rather than assisting us in terms of trying to combat the effects of this pandemic.
Professor Venter, would you like to comment there?
Because I totally agree with that. I think when the vaccine trial started, there were actually quite a number of prominent people that took the vaccine to show that there's trust in it. But I think it's the responsibility of healthcare workers, but also the public, to actually go and read up science, not go and read on all the nonsense that you see on YouTube videos and so on, but go and actually understand the science to see that these vaccines are safe. I've personally enrolled in the vaccine trial. I took the Oxford vaccine because I trust the technology. I wasn't scared to take that. And I think that what we see now with the clinical trials that comes out is they are, they actually look quite good. They're relatively safe. There's been very few or adverse events. And I think that we are moving forward positively. But the only way that all of this effort will actually come to something is that when people that's in prominent roles, especially healthcare workers, make sure that they understand how this works and don't sell nonsense to the public. So it's important that they actually endorse this vaccine as well. They're the group that's at highest risk and probably the group that will get the vaccine first. So they will place their patients in danger by not taking the vaccine. So I think it's very important that that's maybe a place where we will start to show trust and willingness to take the vaccine.
So, I mean, we're talking about the need for proper education. We heard Dr. Muluwabe speaking about that as well, the basis of his scientific education as a doctor in the first place. Education, 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 and of course in the media as well, fact-based, 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 and listening to science being key as well. But this has also been a very emotional journey, hasn't it? I mean, I spoke to a friend of mine whose mother is a doctor in the UK. She is also very elderly. She's been over there for a long time and she's still working as a medical professional. And she messaged me last night and she said, my mother's getting the first jab tomorrow. And she was sitting there in tears. And this is a family of scientists and doctors. And they are taking the news like that there is science that has gone into it to make sure that these vaccines are being made available to those who need it first and need it most importantly. Dr. Mahdi, or Professor Mahdi, if I can come to you, you have been Mr. Fact, Mr. Science, but you can't move away from the fact that this has also been a very emotional journey that, like you keep pointing out, South Africa is only at the beginning of right now.
Correct. So it's been an emotional journey, both for scientists as well as the public. And it's not to say that scientists have got it right all the time. In fact, there's a time at an early stage of the pandemic when myself and others actually said face masks are not really going to make much of a difference. But we were wrong. And we self-corrected. And I think that's really important, is that we need to understand that there's always opportunity to self-correct and to basically come up to date based on the latest scientific evidence. But whatever we do and whatever approach we take has to be based on the latest knowledge. And we can't continue on a pathway that's based on outdated understanding or lack of understanding of what COVID-19 is all about. And that's one of the reasons why, as an example, I've indicated that the single most important thing we need to do right now is a ban on mass gatherings. The other type of risk in terms of being infected because of not washing your hands, we know now that is still there, but it's really nominal in relation to everything else. So I think important is for us just to continue tailoring our approach based on the latest scientific evidence.
Okay, we're into the last few minutes of our conversation, and I think the points made by Professor Mahdi is perfect in terms of where he stands as we leave this conversation. But allow me then to bring in Professor Venter just for some closing remarks from you as a virologist, as somebody who's at the coalface of this, and gleaning all the information you can from around the world on this. What for you, Professor Venter, is something you'll be looking out for as we watch the various vaccines roll out across the world, and here we sit at the bottom of sub-Saharan Africa wondering, when we will be part of something similar? What should we be looking out for?
Yes, I think coming back to what Shabir said as well, is as scientists, we know that we change our mind according to science. And so it's important to actually follow the current science and decide on the basis of that what is working and what is not. So the initial vaccine trials is, based on determining the safety of this, but also the efficacy. But there will be more data coming out as more people get the vaccine and different groups are actually exposed to it. And that will help us to set some rules, who should and who shouldn't get the vaccine, how should the doses be adapted. So nothing that happens at the moment will be the final rules around the vaccine. I think it is important, as I said before, to understand the different technologies, and also don't be fooled and don't be scared by social media or by YouTube videos and things of people that pretend to be a healthcare worker. You don't even know if they really are. But to actually go to the good scientific data and publications and look there to get your information. And I think that the initial trials that we see is really encouraging. I think that there's safety there, that we can trust in the vaccines as well. But it's going to be so important that we actually then buy into the vaccine. For me, it's really tragic to see first world countries that have the opportunity to vaccinate the majority of their population, where you then get this false information and people that are not willing to take the vaccine, while we sit here like you said, in the bottom of the world and wish that we could get enough vaccine to cover our population. So it's initially really just going to be the high risk group. It's important to encourage your elderly parents, if the vaccine gets here, other high risk individuals to get the vaccine, and healthcare workers. And from there on, the rest of us will have to continue with the other measures, continue to wear your mask. We know now that if both, if all people wear the mask, that we will be protected. It doesn't help if only some of us wear the mask. You need to wear it correctly as well. Cover your nose and your mouth, not just your mouth, then it doesn't do anything. And also to ensure that we have social distancing to continue. As we know, it is difficult in certain settings to do that, but I absolutely agree on mass gatherings. This is not the time to have big social events, but also even big church gatherings. It doesn't make sense to tell people to social or to have social distancing going on in small groups, but you allow big church gatherings to just continue.
Okay, Professor Venter, thank you so much for that. And allow us to give the last word then to Dr. Stan Molowabe, who's the principal officer at GEMS, who sponsored this very, very enlightening conversation. Dr. Molowabe, a very long journey you've taken in your first year in this very important position, but one that still has a long way to go, as we've heard from both Professor Venter and Professor Mahdi, a key role that an organization such as yourself needs to play going forward. Where do you see yourself fitting in as we hopefully edge closer to this next chapter in this battle against COVID-19?
Now, I think as a healthcare funder, we recognize that immunization, and not only for COVID-19, the immunization programs that we have are a very important part of healthcare prevention and ensuring that we are a healthy nation. Obviously, COVID is in focus now. So within our environment, we provide for that. We've always had a vaccination benefit. In anticipation of a vaccine being approved, we have actually enhanced the vaccination benefit within GEMS. So I hope that that will be the attitude of other healthcare funders. When you think about it, only 9 million South Africans have private healthcare insurance. The rest of the plus minus 51 million still have to be catered for. And we need to work together with government to ensure that we promote access to the vaccine once it is available and registered for use in South Africa. And that's my message. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll leave it there. This conversation brought to you by Mail and Guardian and, of course, GEMS, COVID-19 vaccine in the road to a recovery. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Stan Molowabe from GEMS, and, of course, Professor Shabir Mahdi and Professor Mariki Fenter, experts in their field. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the work that you've done, both behind closed doors and in the public eye, trying to keep all of us up to speed and educated in what we need to know as we take one step further in this very long road to recovery. The recording of this conversation will be made available by the Mail and Guardian a little later on. And until then, please stay safe, wear your mask, social distance, and let's do what we can to ensure that everybody remains safe. Take care and be safe. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks, Prof. Thanks.